Thank you, Adrian, and good morning again, everyone. So hopefully you can see my screen clearly and hear me quite clearly as well. I'll be taking you through a brief introduction into climate change, some foundational concepts that's important for people to understand, because many may be familiar with climate change, many may not be. So it's good to have this foundational session where we just chat through some of the basics to get everybody on kind of a good level of understanding as we approach some of the more technical issues later in today's session and the workshop. So just to start off with what's been happening globally and why this is important. So many may be familiar with this report. It's done by the World Economic Forum. It's their global risk report, which they do annually. And you can see I've highlighted the climate action failure as a top risk by likelihood and top risk by impact. And these were top of mind of business leaders, political leaders, and people from across the globe in different leadership positions. And if I just circle further there, all the different events that are linked to climate change, you see that this map starts to look a lot scarier. So the reasons for this workshop is clear from the slide, and I think judging from the participation of the participants in the workshop today, everyone kind of is on the same page here that this is a real risk that we need to start looking at and thinking about ways in which how to manage and mitigate and adapt to these risks. So onto some key definitions and more foundational concepts in the climate change space. Greenhouse gas emissions is a critical concept to understand. So since the 1700s or so, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, humans have been emitting more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So these include carbon dioxide and methane, and we'll talk a bit more about these later. And so while these gases are important to the natural environment, the quantities that we've been emitting have been a lot more than what can be absorbed. And so as we've been emitting more and more greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide or methane, they've been trapped in the atmosphere and therefore retain the sun's heat, causing the Earth to increase in the temperature to increase, commonly referred to as the greenhouse effect. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, there are three levels or three scopes that people normally refer to. Now, the first scope, scope one, are emissions that result from activities that are under the direct control of a company. These include, combustion of fuel on the site from gas boilers, or the emissions from the company vehicles from the fleet, or even emissions from companies' air conditioning and air heating within their offices. The second level of emissions from a company one can look at, scope 2 emissions, are the indirect emissions that result from purchasing electricity. The use of electricity results in greenhouse gases being emitted, and therefore it's an important component of a company's overall greenhouse gas emissions. The last component is scope 3 emissions, and these are all the other indirect emissions from activities of the company that they do not control directly. So these are part of the company's value chain or supply chain. So they're associated with procurement of goods, as well as with business travel, waste, and water. So we'll get more into some of the details later on, but it's good to have a foundational understanding of what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are, as these are important when looking at companies and portfolios, and when we talk about disclosures, important disclosures that a company needs to make. What are the sources and sinks of carbon? So here on the slide, we can see that fossil fuels and industry are a major source of emissions. Land use change is also a major source of emissions. So that land use change can be from farming, from urbanization, and from deforestation, and this causes the greenhouse gases to be emitted. Fossil fuels and industry, mentioned this on the previous slide, of using electricity or burning fuel, or whatever other industrial activity may occur. But it's also important to understand that they are also sinks of carbon. So our natural landscapes act as a sink for carbon. Trees, shrubs, vegetation, they suck out carbon, CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. Similarly, the ocean is also a massive sink or storer of carbon dioxide. So all the plants and vegetation and animals in the ocean, they are sucking up carbon and they perform a service to the environment of storing carbon. And it's important that we protect these things because they're an important storer of carbon dioxide. An important concept to understand is also temperature targets and 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. What does this mean? So when we talk about temperature increasing, we don't mean that we're looking at what has the temperature, global average temperature risen above the levels of pre-industrial human society. So here, the Paris Agreement spoke about 2 degrees. We need to target 2 degrees, but recently, well, a couple of years ago now, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the UNIPCC, they released a special report about why 1.5 degree target is important. So we need to look at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and then you'll see that the impacts that climate change could have is quite severe, and the difference between those two levels is also quite stark. So if you look at the impact on extreme weather, there could be a 100% increase in flood risk at a 1.5 degree level and a 170% increase in flood risk at a 2 degree level. Similarly, stark differences occur in the difference in the impact on biodiversity. If you look at what happens to species, how they're different, what's the predicted change in the level of species of biodiversity in 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees. And all throughout the slide, you can see the different impacts on Arctic ice, on communities and people, on sea level, on oceans, on coral bleaching, on costs, etc., etc. So it's quite important that we look, that we urgently get to or target a 1.5 degree target, because the impacts could be quite stark if we overshoot that. And we are on track at the current levels to overshoot that. So urgent action is needed in order to protect our planet from these really severe impacts. Onto the concept of a carbon budget. So the global carbon budget is from 2020 on. In order to stabilize at a 1.5 degrees Celsius target, then we, for a 67% chance of reaching that target, we can't emit more than 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And that's ever. So that's only 12 years of 2018 emissions left. So if you think about how much of greenhouse gas emissions we emitted in 2018, we've only got about 12 years left of that if we want to stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. For a 50% chance, so that's reducing the probability, then we can emit more CO2, but again, then you reduce the likelihood. And it's important to remember that this is forever. So this is our carbon budget, and we need to kind of stay within that budget to make sure we don't warm the planet more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. I think right about now we kind of around 1.3 degrees above where we were. So the need for action is quite urgent. When we talk about climate change and mitigating the risks and adapting from climate change, the fossil fuel conversation comes up, and the issue of fossil fuel comes up. And this slide is showing the fossil fuel reserves across the world. And it shows that if we had to burn up all the reserves of fossil fuels, be it coal, oil, natural gas, we would well exceed the carbon budget, and we will overshoot our targets. So this is just a slide to illustrate that point, that where are the huge fossil fuel reserves, which countries play an important role in the climate change conversation, and it's to illustrate that we cannot burn all of these fuels going forward. We need to find new solutions. Again, showing the concept of a carbon budget on a graph here. We're talking about carbon emissions, and we're moving forward in time, and everything underneath these graphs here that you see, that's kind of our carbon budget and where we need to stay. We are currently increasing our level of emissions, so we need to go from an increase to a flatlining where we stop increasing, so the rate of change of carbon that we emit per year starts to stay constant, and then it needs to decline. And very important to show on this slide is that we need to head to a point of net zero emissions by 2050. So we need to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting, but then also start to suck out and store carbon out of the atmosphere more and more and more, so that by the time we get to 2050, we are at a level of net zero. And this is an important concept. It comes up all the time, the race to net zero that we're targeting, we're getting to 2050. And we're going to talk more about, different climate change scenarios and different metrics and targets later on in the session. But this is important to show that, we want to move our carbon budget to get to net zero. And everything under that line is the carbon that we have left. We can only use that much, as mentioned on the previous slide. So we need to get to net zero by 2050 in order to kind of stay within and stabilize, to stay within our targets and stabilize our climate. So onto a poll question now, here just to test your understanding of the what's been presented so far, or to get a sense of your level of understanding in the room. So how confident would you feel in engaging in a discussion on climate change? So not confident at all, not confident, confident, or very confident. So if you could respond to that poll, that would be great, so we can get a sense of people's level of understanding in the room. Okay, so we see some answers coming through. It's kind of split between the various participants. The majority, or 63%, seems to be not confident. We've got a few people that are confident, which is great. And we've got one person so far that's very confident. So we're going to give it a few more seconds before we close the poll. So if you haven't responded, please go ahead. But thanks for those who've responded so far. It looks like many people are not as confident. So hopefully at the end of the session, you will be we will be more confident, and we'll move you further up that chain. All right. So thanks everyone who's participated. It's great to get a sense of people's level of understanding in the room, and so we know how to kind of pitch it. So thanks to those who've responded to that. And we're going to discuss a couple more important concepts in the climate change sphere, and this is the kinds of risks that we normally refer to, which is firstly physical, and then secondly transition risks. Physical risks refer to the physical impacts of climate change, and because we're talking to a financial services orientated audience today, we want to highlight the importance that physical risks refer to how the impacts of climate change, or the physical impacts of climate change, could impact financial performance. And similarly, transition risks are the risks that arise due to changes in regulations, policies, technologies, markets, and reputations, or we want to talk about how that could potentially impact the financial performance of your investments or your assets or your businesses. And it's also important to highlight these two things because these are important concepts that TCFD highlights, and for disclosures, it's also important to understand these. So chatting a bit more about defining transition risks. So these are the risks that will impact your future cash flows, impact future financial performance, and these come from the potential changes in regulations and policies. One example could be policy changes in carbon prices or carbon taxes, which could lead to stranded assets. And then liability risks is also an important risk to understand, as we see that certain companies have been taken to court and have been found guilty and required to pay certain fines or certain settlements as a result of their activities. And then in the South African case, for example, and that's important for many people here today. We're very reliant on coal, oil, and the oil to liquid sector. And so we face significant transition risks due to climate change. Onto the physical risk side of things. So acute physical risks refers to those risks that are event-driven. These could be from severe weather that occurs. So you can have storms, cyclones, floods. These are the kinds of acute physical risks or events that could happen, and that could be more increasing due to climate change. The second one is the chronic physical risks, and these are risks that present themselves because of longer-term shifts in climate patterns. These longer-term shifts in climate patterns, excuse me, these can be, for example, from higher sustained temperatures over time. So heat waves that persist. These could be from sea level rise on changes in temperature or climate for a certain area. So your droughts and things like that persist over time. So these are the examples of physical risks, which can be either acute, event-driven, or chronic, that persist over time. Transition risks are important to consider, and it's a big part of TCFD. And it's important to understand that this is an economic issue, and there are certain sectors that are kind of more exposed to climate change than others. And this is an analysis that was done that shows different sectors, particularly focusing on the mining sectors and primary sectors. And they show that these are, sectors that are vulnerable to climate change, and because they provide a huge economic benefit to the country and to businesses, it's important for investors and asset managers to have a view on which potential sectors are particularly exposed to climate change. To this next part of the intro to climate change, which is just a brief touch point on climate policy, which is an important consideration in transition risks. Firstly, I wanted to show this picture of where the Paris Agreement pledges and targets were were putting us on a trajectory of. And what's important to note from here is that the old pledges of the Paris Agreement were different, or where there was a gap between where we needed to be and what the pledges were. So the pledges were actually, probably not ambitious enough for the kind of action that we needed. So while some people may say, oh yes, the policy environment is not a major risk right now because, the pledges, in fact, don't actually translate into big changes. But what will happen in time is that the gap between the original pledges and new future pledges or new policies and updates will close, and therefore the policies will get a lot tighter, and the action on climate change will get more urgent, and therefore the policy or transition risks will increase, and the impact on companies that aren't taking action will be more severe. In South Africa, there has been quite a bit of action and activity in the climate change space. And this slide is showing, what's the long-term adaptation flagship research program, which was kind of coordinated from the Department of the Environment. But there's a long list of activities, policies, and papers that have come out, and this will all inform future and current policy in the local context. Internationally as well, the countries, here it's showing the emissions from different countries in 2018, and the bigger circles on the map show the countries with more emissions. As you can see in Africa, South Africa is the country with the highest amount of emissions per year. You can expect significant changes in countries where the bigger black dots are. And we can also expect, if you're investing internationally, or companies have businesses that have operations internationally, we can expect to see tightening of regulations in economies over the world. And here, this slide is showing where there's carbon pricing initiatives being taken place. So this refers to mostly carbon tax, and it's showing if which countries have either implemented a target tax or are scheduled to implement a target tax or are thinking about implementing a carbon tax. And it's important considerations for investing in companies with operations in different countries to understand the climate policy level within those countries. And here are countries that have already committed to ambitious net zero targets. So operations or companies or assets that you have in these geographies are definitely going to be exposed to certain climate change risk, and certain countries will be transitioning much faster than others. So the risks from transitions are higher in some countries versus others. The next part here is on to just some useful tools that one can look at. The water risk filter is a spatial tool that one can look at to see what the impacts are of potential droughts or operational risks from increasing climate change is going to impact water availability and water supply. So one can plug in the company's operations, the location of that, and that will give you an assessment of the operational risks, of the physical reputational risks in that space from a water risk space, water risk view. The next one is the Green Book, which got created by the CSIR. They've put together this resource that's free to use. Anyone can go onto the website, which is thegreenbook.co.za. And if you want to have a look at any potential municipality in South Africa, this is a very useful and handy tool to give you an understanding and a view of the climate resilience of certain settlements in the different municipalities in South Africa. The NBI and BCG has produced a very interesting report on how certain trade and commodities are exposed, and the vulnerability of those sectors to climate change risk. And this is also, again, freely available for people to look at. And it's also important for asset managers to understand the kind of sectors that they're investing in and how those different sectors are exposed to climate change risk. Again, here talking about the sector exposure, but this is looking at the emissions per sector. So sectors with a higher amount of emissions will probably be exposed to more risks or more transition risks, either from stranded assets or carbon taxes or other kinds of policy risks that may present themselves. While there are tools available, and some are paid for and some are free, but the ones we showed so far are kind of freely available tools, there are also alliances of organizations and companies come together. One such alliance is the Alliance for Climate Action, or ACAs. The Alliance for Climate Action is calling on companies and cities and other organizations to make certain commitments in order to reach the net zero targets, greenhouse gas emission targets in South Africa by 2050. And these are, it's a great platform for collaboration, for knowledge sharing, for people to come together, to work together to improve their understanding or to collaborate in order to implement certain activities that's going to help them reduce their risks. Then the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which we'll be talking a bit more later, while there are tools available and while there are alliances available, this is kind of bringing those two things together, where the Science-Based Targets Initiative helps companies set targets that are obviously, as the name implies, set based on science. So it might be difficult for companies in certain sectors or investors or financial institutions to understand how to set targets. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative is one such initiative that's helping organizations to develop their own internal targets to help them with their performance management of climate change and climate change risks.